I am so delighted to be here. Vicki! Oh, Vicki, how are you? So we get some old friends and we get some new people, and whoever you are and wherever you are, I am delighted that you're with me, and I'm looking forward to giving a good talk about Boston radio. Oh my God, Mike. It's amazing. And I don't mean microphone. I mean, I'm getting messaged by some of my old friends. And when it comes to radio, it's a worldwide community. Radio changed my life, okay? And for some of you, if you're fans of a certain rock band named Rush, you know I discovered them and they dedicated a couple of albums to me. This won't be the talk about Rush, but since it's a talk about radio, it wouldn't have happened without radio. So let's take a trip down memory lane. If you're not from here, some of these folks are going to be like, who? But I think you'll be able to find an analog in your own city. And for those of you who are from here, I think you'll be able to go, yeah, I remember some of them. So let's first start by going way back. Now, let's see if you can see my screen. If you can see my screen, I'm going to make it bigger in a second, okay? And what I want to talk to you about today is a mass medium that changed all of our lives. And that, of course, is radio. So why do I do this? What you're looking at is all that remains of WRES, the Wollaston Radio Electric Shop. It was the first radio station in Quincy, Massachusetts, which is where I'm from, and no one tried to preserve it. No one tried to keep it alive. The station is long gone. I get that. Radio stations come, radio stations go. But there are a lot of stations that changed our lives and that were important to us. And it's kind of sad that many of them weren't preserved at all. There's a line in Hamilton I like to quote a lot. It says, who lives, who dies, who tells your story? Who tells the story of the broadcasters who we listened to and who changed our lives? Media historians like me tell their stories, and that's what we're going to talk about today. But every time I drive by buildings like this, buildings where radio stations that influenced people, that played their favorite songs, that gave them announcers and personalities and information, and it's not only gone, but not even remarked upon, not even commemorated. And I think that's kind of a shame. So let's go back to the first radio station in Massachusetts. And by the way, one of the first in the United States. You may have heard that KDKA in Pittsburgh was the first station in the United States. You heard wrong. It was not. It was actually more likely the third, all right? But KDKA in Pittsburgh was owned by Westinghouse, which made appliances. And boy, howdy, did they know how to advertise. They could promote anything. And they promoted the idea that KDKA in Pittsburgh was the first station. Nope. Probably 8MK, which is today still around in Detroit, Michigan, WWJ. And one of the other first stations is this one. This is the AMRAD station, the American Radio and Research Company, in Medford, Massachusetts. And if you're not from here, Medford is about 7 or 8 miles from Boston. It was considered a Boston station, and it went on the air as 1XE. Now, those are funny call letters. The X stood for experimental, because in the early days of radio, everybody thought it was going to be just an experiment. It was later named WGI. Now notice the tower. It's a 306-foot tower. That's how they transmitted. And the folks that worked there, built radios during the daytime and then went on the air at night, because early radio was pretty much only on the air a couple of hours every night. And the folks that were on the air probably weren't heard by a lot of people, but the folks that did hear them, they were impressed. They thought radio was a miracle. Radio was the first mass medium to take people to an event in real time. Now, we take that for granted today. It's like, oh my God, I just waited like 7 seconds for a file to download on the internet. What's going on? But when radio came along, up until radio, if you wanted to know what was going on, you had to wait for the newspaper to come out. Now, in those days, most cities had 3, 4, 5, even 6 newspapers. The bigger cities may have had as many as 8 or 9. Boston at one time had 10. And even at their best, and I still love me some newspapers, I read them every day, but even at their best, there was a lag between when news got to the newspaper and when it got to you. With radio, you were there. And that was considered amazing to people. Now, here is my cultural hero. This is the late, great Eunice Randall. She's 19 years old in this picture, and she built some of the equipment in this picture. Now, the picture is staged. It was a photograph to send out to newspapers and magazines, but it's still pretty amazing that she did this. She was the first woman radio announcer in the entire Eastern United States, and that's pretty thoroughly documented. We've got her on the air as early as 1919, and we absolutely have her on the air in 1920, 21. Eunice did everything, because in those days you had to. She announced. She did traffic reports. They had very early traffic reports in those days, okay? She did the weather. She did announcing songs. And when a guest didn't show up, she sang. Because like I said, you had to be able to do everything in those early days. There was no tape. Tape hadn't been invented yet. So radio is live. And if you're on the air, you've got to be versatile. Eunice was versatile. She could even fix equipment when it broke. And as I said, for all of the stereotypes about women, Eunice proved them all wrong. And she had a long career, not just in radio, but also in amateur radio. She was a dedicated ham. She was ER, then 1 CDP, and then her ham calls were W1 MPP, which she jokingly said stood for W1 Madam Picklepuss. She started a network for blind people. She was sighted, but she started a network for blind people. She called it the Barnyard Network because she started it up in Maine. She was a revolutionary and amazing woman. She was totally forgotten until I started doing research about her. And this isn't just about me. Aren't I swell? I'm just saying, in whatever city you're in, there are people who were forgotten, and they influenced people and they changed lives. Who lives, who dies, who tells your story? I tell Eunice's story all over the country, and as a result, she is now in history books, exactly where she belongs. Now, in the 1920s, they marketed radio to middle-class families. Notice the brochure here. This is an AMRAD brochure, rare brochure. Notice the daddy and the mommy and the 2 children. And notice they're all wearing headphones because, nothing new under the sun. Amplification kind of was still in the early stages. So if you wanted to hear radio, you put on headphones. And radio was marketed as something for everyone. But if you looked at the marketing, it was all white people, which is kind of historically inaccurate because radio was very popular in the Black community, but you just wouldn't see any brochures that featured that because America was still segregated back then, let's be honest. Meanwhile, the AMRAD station that I just showed you, they had African-American performers on the air as early as 1922. So they were at the forefront of doing stuff like this. But yeah, if you got a radio, you were considered to be really successful in your community. And we're just starting to get to a place where radio is bursting onto the scene all over the country. When we first started in 1920 and 1921, very few stations on the air, very few radios. But by 1922, there's something called the radio craze. And suddenly we go from like maybe 20 stations to 252 stations. Every city wants a radio station, and people are buying radios all over the place. Now, here we have a very young Big Brother Bob Emery. Now, if you're not from here, I know what you're thinking. You're thinking, wow, what a weird circular thing that is. Yeah, that's what microphones looked like back in those days. It's the old, I think, carbon mics. They distorted everything. In fact, they drove your voice up, which is where we get the custom of guys having big, deep voices. Fortunately, Eunice Randall, although she was female, had a really resonant voice. And so it didn't distort her voice, but it kept an awful lot of people off the air. Big Brother Bob Emery got his start in radio way back in 1921. He was working for a department store called Gilchrist's, long gone and hard to find. But in those days, all the department stores had little competitions between each other, not just for selling, but for performing. They had like talent shows, and, one department store would have a talent show and try to outdo another department store. And this would get written up in the newspapers, and it was considered a really big deal, and people got very excited about it. And Big Brother Bob Emery got his start in 1921 for the Gilchrist Quartet. He sang on the radio and played his little ukulele. People liked him. They really liked him. By 1924, he has his own show, but not as a singer. He reimagines himself as a children's show host. Now, here again, wherever you're from, every city has a Big Brother or an Aunt Sally or a, Uncle David. They all try to create themselves as family members. They read stories to the children. Eunice Randall did this as well. Everybody had a story lady or a story guy. And Big Brother not only reads stories, he creates what is called the Big Brother Club in 1924. And he will go on to a 5-decade career on radio and on television as a very popular children's show host. And it all got started at little 1XE WGI in Medford Hillside, 1921, 1924. Now, here we have a very hilarious picture. Early radio, as I said, is all live, okay? And the very first studios are often in the plant where the radios are manufactured. Notice the engineer here. This is Harry Dyson. Okay, he was also a ham radio operator. Notice how worried he looks. And he's got good reason, because the singer and the pianist are like inches away from tubes and wires and electrical equipment. If they touch the wrong thing, oi, it's gonna be dangerous. And gradually, it dawned on some of the early stations, we need an actual studio. We can't just expect people to come into the plant. They might get electrocuted. WBZ, which is still around, okay? Still 100 years. They got their start. They were not in Boston back then. They got their start on the 19th of September, 1921 in Springfield, Massachusetts, which is about 85 miles from Boston. This will become a problem. But at the time, it was like, oh boy, we've got a radio station. And WBZ went on the air from the Eastern States Exposition, was like a Jagunda County fair. The newspapers just about ignored it. It made page 7. Why? The newspapers saw radio as competition right from Jump Street. They were worried that radio was going to take away their readers. It didn't, but this is what they were worried about. So WBZ gets started in the Westinghouse plant. This is exciting. This is dangerous. We're going to need studios. And so it is that WBZ finally moves its studios to a hotel in August of 1923. Why a hotel, Donna? Well, very obvious. Remember, all radio is live. And if a guest doesn't show up, what's a poor girl to do? Well, if you don't have a singing person like someone like Eunice or Big Brother Bob Emery, every hotel has a hotel orchestra. So you just contact the hotel orchestra. Hey, guys and gals, want to get some free publicity? Want to be heard by thousands of people? We got it. Here it is. Come on down. And that is one of the reasons why a lot of early stations put their studios in hotels. Another reason, they're gradually going to move towards studio audiences. And the people at the hotel were like, hey, we'll come down and watch the broadcast, because performers didn't like performing for no one. They liked having someone there to clap, to cheer, sometimes to boo, but at least it was interaction. So early stations end up putting their studios in hotels. Now, in 1924, remember I told you WBZ is out in Springfield? Problem. Most of the big name performers, much as I love Springfield, they ain't coming there. They're in Boston. They're in New York. They're in Chicago. They're in the big markets. And since radio is live, you need performers. And if they're not coming to Springfield, you got to get them to come. But what if they don't want to come? And so it was that in February of 1924, WBZ finally opened a Boston studio. And again, back to the hotel thing, they opened it at the Hotel Brunswick, long gone and hard to find. Later, they're going to go to the Hotel Statler, and then they're going to settle in at the Hotel Bradford, which is where they're going to be for years, okay? But hotels, very, very important to the history of early radio. WBZ does not come to Boston until February 24th, 1924. They ultimately stay. They start diminishing their programming from Springfield. But at the time, they're doing both. They think they can get away with it, but it's going to cause technical problems. And in the end, they're going to end up pretty much completely in Boston. But what if you didn't live near Boston or live near Springfield? Well, maybe you had a portable. Now, a portable was exactly what it sounded like. In the early days of broadcasting, see these four guys looking very serious? They're not that serious. I know who they are. They're all people whose names you would not know because they're mostly engineers. They're in the background setting things up. But their job is to put the radio station in a truck. This was a Rio Speedwagon, hence the name later on, REO Speedwagon, the rock band. Yeah, it was originally a truck, a Rio Speedwagon. And they put the radio station in the truck. They took it out to a county fair, or they took it out to a city that didn't have a radio station, and they just set up shop in theaters, all kinds of restaurants. This is going to cause tremendous interference. But in the early days, people are like, oh my God, a radio station has come to town. So yeah, portables. This one is WTAT. They wanted to get Watt, W-A-T-T. It wasn't available, so they settled for WTAT. The call letters later get changed in September of 1924 to WEEI, call letters that are still around. That stood for Edison Electric Illuminating Company. It was originally owned by the Edison Company, the electric company. There were two ways to get call letters. You could either request them from the government and fill out endless paperwork, or you could just take what the government gave you. Most stations just took what they were given. WBZ does not stand for anything in terms of the call letters. That's just what the government gave them. But WEEI, that was a requested call. They asked for it. They got it. Now, in those early days, not everybody has telephones. You hear a program on the air, you like it. What do? You send an applause card. Just like ham radio had like QSL cards, like I've received your transmission, radio had applause cards. And you could get them at your favorite radio shop or your electric store or department stores that sold radios. You filled it out, you sent it to the announcer you heard on the air, who, by the way, was not called a DJ. The term DJ does not come into common use until the late 40s, early 50s. Back then, they're just announcers. That's what they do. They announce. And applause cards are not only good for people feeling good because they got some applause. Some announcers use them to get raises. It was like, hey, look at all the applause cards I got. Which, of course, I know what you're thinking. What about if they got their friends? Yeah, that was a real problem. Some of them just kind of got their friends to send them in. But by and large, it was listeners that sent them in. And this is how you let people know you liked what you were hearing. Here's another way you let people know you liked what you were hearing. You saved Echo stamps. Echo was a company, and DXing was something that a lot of people had begun doing. DXing stands for distance listening, because AM signals, and that's all there were in those days, AM signals traveled a long way. To this day, I still remember as a kid, I could get WBAL in Baltimore, okay? I could get a PJB in the Dutch Antilles. I mean, there were stations that traveled for miles. And there were a couple of companies that let you right away and get verification stamps. And you filled out an album and you kept track of which stations you heard. And it was kind of fun to do it. Speaking of fun, the guy on the right, and by the way, his suit isn't torn. That's just a defect in the photo. It's a rare photo. And it shows the late, great John Shepard III with Babe Ruth, who, by the way, Babe Ruth, the famous baseball player, he got on the radio as early as 1922. He was one of the people that embraced the new technology early. A lot of athletes did. A lot of athletes started going on the radio, being interviewed. The fans loved it. And here we have John Shepard III, who was the founder of WNAC in Boston, still around, although under different call letters, WRKO. But there he is, and he gets to meet Babe Ruth. Now, John Shepard III owned a department store, the Shepard store, also long gone. It had offices in Boston and Providence. And he also founded something called the Yankee Network, which was a New England network that kind of competed with NBC and CBS and those networks, but it was aimed at New England. His stations were among the first to broadcast Red Sox games, which also people got really excited about. They broadcast sports in general. And sometimes they got some of the famous people, the famous players on the air, and the public was just amazed. They couldn't have been happier about it. Now here we have poor Gus Rooney. I say poor Gus Rooney, he didn't know what he was getting himself into that day on April 13th, 1926, when John Shepard III hired him to broadcast the Red Sox home opener. Oh, my friends, it was 32 degrees with a biting wind. And where today, baseball, football, basketball, you got a whole team. You got 2 announcers, you got the color commentator, you got the person down on the field, you got 16 other people. Back then, it's just Gus. The game went 4 hours. At the end of the day, he couldn't speak for a week and a half. He had such bad laryngitis. It was just people in the newsroom. He was a sports writer who had just been asked to do the game. And I don't think he ever wanted to go through that again. In the end, he did a couple of other games that year, but it was certainly a memorable experience. And it was the first time that people heard Red Sox games on the radio in real time. Now, it wasn't the first time they heard baseball on the radio. There had been baseball on the radio since 1921, just not Red Sox games. In fact, in Boston, WBZ broadcast a Boston Braves game. But if you were a Red Sox fan, you had to wait till 1926. And the first guy to do it was a sports writer from the Boston Traveler and the sister paper, the Boston Herald, Gus Rooney. Now, Boston becomes the home of all kinds of famous sportscasters. Here's Jim Britt, better known as Jimmy Britt back then, and he came from Buffalo, where he had been doing minor league baseball, and he replaced Fred Hoy. Now, Fred Hoy was a legend in sportscasting in Boston. Unfortunately, he had a bit of a problem with, how shall we say, politely drinking, and that led to his ultimately losing his gig. But for the years that he was on the air, people adored Fred Hoy, and they had a very hard time finding someone to take his place. What Fred Hoy could do was just make the game understandable, whether you were a fan or just learning about baseball. Jim Britt did the same thing. Jim Britt came here in 1939. He was around here off and on till the 50s. When he wasn't doing baseball games, he did other sports. And he also did a very popular thing called candlepin bowling. Now, if you're from other states, it's like Google candlepin bowling. We are one of the few parts of the country where it's really, really popular. And Jim Britt did a candlepin bowling show. God bless him. People loved it. Now, here we have the WBZ newsroom. What do you notice? First thing you notice is they made everybody come to work in ties. Second thing you notice is, wow, they're all white men. Why, yes, they were. Now, what's interesting is there were a couple of women who were doing commentary on CBS and NBC, okay? Dorothy Thompson, Catherine Cravens. But by and large, it was mostly white guys that were doing the majority of the news broadcasts at stations all across the country. I'm not saying that in a nasty way. I'm saying there were Black reporters, but they just couldn't get hired. So they focused on writing for the Black press. Some of their work has been digitized. It is well worth reading. But back then, this is what a typical newsroom looked like. And this one, you notice in the background here, it looks like NBC. Yeah, back then, WBZ is part of the NBC radio network. So they get their national news from NBC and they do their local news themselves. Picture was taken in 1939. Notice this guy has his press pass in his hat. Men wore a lot of hats back in those days, which is why I was always amused by that dance band, Men Without Hats. This was a social convention back then that men were supposed to wear hats when they went out formally to cover the news. I never understood it, but WBZ Newsroom, 1939. Now, if you were a woman, one of the few jobs you could get was doing a cooking show or doing a fashion show or doing advice and recipes and homemaking shows. Louise Morgan, her real name was Louise Woolley. She had just gotten divorced in 1943, and she had a background in home economics. She approached the Yankee Network and got on the air in New England doing a radio show aimed at the homemaking audience. She became wildly popular with the female audience, and because she had such an eye for news about celebrities, she went on the air in early television and became very popular with pretty much everyone. She had an amazing voice. Many people still remember her even today. But as I said, this was one of the few jobs a woman could get back then, was doing a so-called women's show. Or if you wanted, you could be a singer. Here we have Judy Valentine. Judy Valentine is still alive. She's like 96 now. Wonderful person. But she got her start in the early 1940s, singing with her then husband, Sherm Feller. Some of you may remember Sherm Feller if you're a Red Sox fan. Ladies and gentlemen, boys and girls. Yeah, he became the park announcer at Fenway Park. And he would announce the players and the statistics and all this other good stuff. But that was later. In the 1940s and 50s, he was a radio announcer, and he became one of the DJs because they're starting to use that term. He and his wife do live music on the air. And then they also have a late night radio show where they play the hits of that day. Very interesting couple. She goes on to be the assistant or the sidekick to Bozo the Clown. She also has a couple of hit records. And he goes on to become the stadium announcer at Fenway Park, public address announcer. Very interesting person. One of the first African-American announcers in Boston is William Sebastian Sabby Lewis. He and Edward Petty in the mid to late 1940s. They're both jazz pianists on two different stations. And in that era, it was common for some of the jazz musicians to announce their own programs. And so it was that Sabby Lewis got on Boston radio announcing his own programs. We have him on WVOM, the voice of Massachusetts, which becomes WBOS, and later on WILD. But there aren't a lot of Black announcers in Boston radio, nor will there be till the mid-1950s. In other cities, very similar. The first Black announcer that we know about is probably Jocko Maxwell and Jack Cooper. Jack Cooper's on the air in Chicago, possibly as early as 1923. Jocko Maxwell's on the air in 1929. But in a source that I found in the late 30s, it said there were only 3 Black announcers in the entire country. And in the 40s, the Black announcers were basically musicians who announced their own programs. Now, sometimes people from Boston ended up becoming nationally famous. Some of you may remember Bob and Ray. Bob Elliott, Ray Goulding. They got started around 1946 at the old WHDH. They originally were not a team, and this also happened. This happened with Lauren and Wally. They were originally 2 guys working at the same station, but they liked each other, and they used to visit each other's shows, and they used to kind of crack wise with each other, make jokes, make snide remarks. And by some accounts, the general manager at WHDH said, "Hey, you guys are funny. You do parodies. Why don't you do a show?" And so it was in 46, 47 that Matinee with Bob and Ray made its debut, and the audience in Boston loved it. They loved it so much that NBC was listening. And in 1951, they gave Bob and Ray a tryout on the network as kind of like a summer replacement. It went over really well. And they soon ended up on the network, and they would sometimes come back to Boston to be at the NBC affiliate, which back then was WBZ. But it all got started at a local radio station in 1946, and then they ended up nationally famous. Now, here's my cultural hero, the late, great Arnie Woo Ginsburg, who never intended to be an announcer. He was an engineer. He produced. He did all kinds of background stuff. But he kind of got on the air sort of accidentally, and the public loved him because he didn't have a radio voice. He had a voice that cracked and broke up, and it was high-pitched, and Arnie just made fun of it. He called himself old aching adenoids, old leather lungs. He made fun of his voice. He made fun of various and sundry things. It was never mean. It was never rude or nasty. He was just this unassuming, down-to-earth guy. And as a kid, I loved him because he kept his own name. Back in those days, as we will see, you had to have a house name, which was a name that you were given by the station. It was usually a nondescript name. It didn't sound like you came from a certain place. And many announcers were asked to change their name, not just Arnie Ginsburg because his sounded Jewish. Jim Samprakis, he became Jim Sands. Bill Moya, he became Bill Marlowe. This happened in every city. Arnie wouldn't play. He was Arnie Ginsburg. He died Arnie Ginsburg. He lived Arnie Ginsburg. And the bells and the whistles were part of his shtick on air. He had an air horn. He had an Aruga horn. He had all kinds of horns. And he was on WMEX in Boston, where he became one of the most influential DJs of the 50s and 60s. Arnie Ginsburg changed my life, oh, my brothers and sisters. How so? I was always told that I couldn't be a DJ because women didn't have the voice for it. But Arnie didn't have the voice for it either. And he went on to become the #1 DJ in Boston. And I always thought, if Arnie can do it, I can do it. WMEX was a very schizophrenic radio station. During the day, they played Top 40, and then they went to talk shows with the late, great Jerry Williams, who came to WMEX around 1957 and just revolutionized telephone talk. He would always say, remember your ABCs, be accurate, brief, and concise. And you also had to be over 21 to get on the air. And I was really pleased when I got on a couple of times and I was not 21, but I guess I sounded like I knew what I was doing. Who knows? But he was a very famous talk show host in the Boston market for many years. Now, this guy, this is amusing. Johnny Gardner, he's on the air out at WORC in Worcester, about 50 miles from Boston. And again, remember I told you house names and you couldn't use your real name? His real name was John H. Garabedian. But you're, oh, wow, that sounds pretty ethnic. So for years, he was on the air as Johnny Gardner. And he finally was persuaded to use his real name by somebody we're going to talk about in a couple of minutes, Dick Summer. Johnny Gardner is on the air in Worcester. He ultimately comes to WMEX in Boston, and he takes on WRKO, which by then is a giant top 40 station. And he does some really, really creative things. But it all got started when he was 18 years old and he created himself as Johnny Gardner, and you could join the Johnny Gardner fan club. And my thanks to John H. for giving me that little piece of memorabilia. If we were live, I would bring the actual fan club membership. A lot of DJs had their own fan clubs. Now, here's somebody who was a legend in Boston radio. This is Carl DeSuze. And Carl DeSuze joined WBZ from up in Maine in 1942, and he stayed with BZ. He did 39 years as a morning show host. We had some great morning show hosts in Boston. Carl was a world traveler. He was a raconteur. He could tell a story. The guy was amazing. Over at WMEX, the morning guy was Fenway. Remember house names? Fenway. So when Ed Hyder left, the next guy was Fenway. There were all these people that had, Dan Donovan. There were like 19 Dan Donovans. There were 19 Fenways. Not 19, I exaggerate, but you get the point. I love the logo on the shirt here. WMEX, Fenway. And he signed it to Mel Miller. Mel becomes his boss. And yep, it was quite an interesting time. I wonder how many people knew that Fenway wasn't his real name. But perhaps the most legendary morning show host in Boston was Jess Kane. And I had the privilege of working with Jess when I worked at WHDH for a while. What a gentleman, okay? He came to WHDH in 1957. He stayed for 34 years. The longevity in this town was just incredible, okay? Now, one other thing I want to talk about is this guy. This is Dick Summer. Dick is still alive also, in his 80s, still doing podcasts. Guy is just amazing. He was the overnight DJ at WBZ at a time when nobody gave a rat's patootie about overnights. In fact, most stations signed off at midnight. But he turned overnights into a destination for shift workers, college students, people that just couldn't sleep. He was hilarious. And he had these shticks that he did. He had, the nightlight password, 1 hen, 2 ducks, 3 squawking geese. Yes, I can recite the entire thing. He had all sorts of contests and promotions, and he made overnights into a really important shift. And as I said, he also persuaded John H. Garabedian, Johnny Gardner, to use his real name. You can still hear Dick on the air now and then. Just a fascinating person. Now let's go back to March 13th, 1970. I have a typo in my slide. I'm sorry, I was going to do another one, but this is 1970, okay? And in 1970, these were the big hits. Remember Lay Down by Melanie? Or somebody once pronounced it Mulaney, and I'm like, oi, it's Melanie. Get Ready by Rare Earth, Ride Captain Ride by the Blues Image, The Long and Winding Road by the Beatles, Up Around the Bend by Creedence. Just some great songs on here. WRKO went top 40, okay, in 1967, and they changed everything. And it was just amazing that they were able to take over the top 40 market, in large part because of some of their personalities. Dale Dorman, WRKO, he joined in 1968. He later worked at KISS 108. And by the way, evidently, it wasn't a mistake in my slide because I basically listed when WRKO came on the air as a top 40. I'm having sitting here narrating some of it. I can see more clearly than other slides, but you get the general idea. When WRKO went top 40, Dale Dorman became a legend in morning shows for the top 40 audience because Jess Kane and Carl DeSuze, they were more kind of adult, middle of the road. But Dale Dorman, he was hilarious. He was funny. Uncle Dale. He later worked at Kiss 108. Now, in sports, probably the best known sportscaster in town was Johnny Most. He was originally on WCOP in the early 50s with Leo Egan. Then he went to WVDA, long gone, Vic Deems radio station, WHDH. He was on BZ, you name it, he was there. But he was known for doing the Celtics. And he had this really intense voice, and he'd be screaming about, oh my God, I've never such a dirty, filthy boy. And you thought he was gonna get a heart attack. And he was a real homer. Whatever the Celtics did, it was great. The other team, they were dirty, filthy players. Just a hilarious guy to listen to, Johnny Most. Now here's Joe Green in the BZ Copter. And Joe Green not only did traffic, he wasn't the first. There had been traffic on the air in the Boston market since 1961. But Joe Green saved a life one day. He became very famous for the fact that he actually rescued someone. He was in the WBZ traffic copter doing there's a traffic jam on such and such a street and the traffic is backed up here and he flies over the Merrimack River and he sees a kayaker overturned and it looks like the guy is drowning. His name was Salvatore Simonelli. And Joe Green hovered down and literally rescued him, saved his life. Talk about stuff you can do on the air. He became so legendary for that the mayor the next year, Mayor Kevin White, named April 8th as Joe Green Day. 25 years he did traffic at WBZ. We had a lot of very famous traffic reporters. I know this person. My God, it's me. Yeah, I was the first female DJ in the history of Northeastern University. I went on the air in October of 1968. Took me 4 years to persuade people that if I went on the air, somehow the Republic wouldn't fall. But, I went on the air, the Republic didn't fall, and somehow we all survived, and I went on to a 4-decade media career. But it all started at WNEU, today WRBB, Northeastern University. Now, if you grew up here, every city started seeing the music changing in the late 1960s. WBCN had originally been a classical music station. In fact, WBCN stood for the Boston Concert Network. And they turned on as an album rock station around 1968. And the rest, as they say, is history. WBCN is no longer around, but an awful lot of people listen to them for album rock. And their morning guy was a guy named Charles Lockwood Era. And they also had Carter Allen. Carter Allen joined WBCN in the late 70s. I thank him for this picture of himself. And here's Carter Allen today. He's still around and he's on the air at WZLX. WZLX is a classic rock radio station, which has been classic rock since 1985, still doing really well with that format. Carter has written a couple of fascinating books about his life in album rock and the famous people he met and the records he broke and the stuff that he did. Just a legend in album rock broadcasting. Now here's the on-air staff of KISS 108. The other big change in music was disco. Now, it later came to be called dance music. And this is where another long-standing announcer became famous, Matt Siegel, Matty in the Morning. He had been on television on Channel 5, And then he joined Kiss 108 in January of 1981, still there. Talk about longevity. The guy is amazing. Dale Dorman is on Kiss 108 by this time. Sonny Joy. Karen Blake, one of the few women on the station, and the pseudonymous Lisa Lips, Maddie Siegel's sidekick, because the Lips was the logo for Kiss 108, because, of course, a kiss. There are a number of Kiss stations across the country playing dance music. In the 80s, Kiss 108 is still around, still popular. Now, if you were a woman like me, or if you were a woman like Diane Stern, and you didn't want to do a women's show, you didn't want to do cooking or fashion or advice or celebrity news, Diane Stern became one of the few female news people in Boston radio. She started off at WMLO, a little station in Beverly, Massachusetts. She went over to WEEI. She was at WMEX briefly. She ended up spending 33 years with WBZ until she retired in late 2016. She was a really well-respected news anchor, Diane Stern. Now, by the 1980s, women are finally getting on the air as radio DJs in town. Here's Mozzie Stafford. She was on the air back then at Oldies 103. She later goes on to work for WKLB and various other stations still around, but there she is doing oldies in the 1980s. African-American announcers, like I said, are not as common. Callie Crossley was a legendary producer of documentaries, okay? She was involved with Eyes on the Prize, which some of you may have seen. She then was hired by ABC to be their health and medical correspondent, and she did some work for WGBH TV. In 2010, she got her own program. There are few people more plugged in to the African-American community than she is. She's been on the radio at WGBH, like I said, since 2010, still there. She was on a program on TV called Beat the Press, which was a media criticism program. Just an amazing person on radio and on television. And you can't do a program about Boston radio without talking about Gary LaPierre. Gary LaPierre came to WBZ in 1964, and one of his first gigs was covering the Beatles. The Beatles came to town, and Gary LaPierre got to spend a couple of days with them. Now, there's a gig I would have liked. He was on WBZ for 40 years, okay? And he also did commentary, LaPierre on the Loose, kind of moved more in a conservative direction as time went on. Always a gentleman, always a really good news broadcaster. I remember him well. It was fun to work with him. A great announcer. Now, here's somebody you may remember, Joe and Andy. Joe Martell is still around. Andy Mose died way too young. In the 1980s, they were on WROR FM, and Joe Martell did Saturday Night Live at the Oldies. Joe and Andy were just so much fun to listen to in the morning. I always enjoyed them. But here again, there were solo morning show hosts who were amazing. There were also morning teams, and two of the best were Joe and Andy and Lauren and Wally. Lauren Owens and Wally Brine. Lauren here, Wally there. Wally came from a radio family. His father was Salty Brine. He was on the air in Providence. Lauren and Wally spent 35 years as a team. They started at the old WVBF. Then they went, WVBF became WROR, and people loved them on the radio. One of my favorite talk show hosts was the late, great David Brudnoy. David Brudnoy was a conservative, but he came from that generation of talk show hosts where people were courteous. They didn't call names. They didn't insult you. They didn't say rude stuff. David was one of the most knowledgeable talk show hosts that I knew. I was friends with him for many, many years. We did not agree on much. We had some interesting debates. But what I loved about David is when you listened to his talk show, you always came away feeling like you had learned something. He loved debate. If you could make your point, whether he agreed with you or not, he would give you time on the air to make your point. He died in 2004, lost a battle with AIDS, and he was replaced by Paul Sullivan, who then passed from cancer. And doing that shift now is Dan Ray. Dan is much more conservative than David was, but still, Dan is courteous. I've been on his show a couple of times. Like I said, just a wonderful human being. He took over the show in 2007. He had been a BZTV reporter. He'd also done some print journalism. Very, very well-respected guy. Now, I wanted to stop sharing my screen here, and I'm just going to come back. I hope you can see me all right. There are a number of people I didn't get to, but I do want to talk about what changed in radio. And one of the big things that changed was the end of the Fairness Doctrine. Now, I was no fan of the Fairness Doctrine. It made you fill out endless paperwork, but it also kind of kept radio stations honest because it meant they had to provide both sides. They didn't have to provide them immediately, but they did have to provide them. So what a lot of stations did is they'd have one announcer who was a righty, they'd have another announcer who was a lefty. And as I said, the republic didn't fall. But after the Fairness Doctrine, it kind of opened things up to one-sided talk shows. Rush Limbaugh came on the air in 1988. And a whole host of other one-sided programs did too. That's why I appreciated David Brudnoy, because he was a big believer in the fact that radio did not have to be a bunch of screeds against one group or another, that you could actually debate. That's kind of what I miss. I miss the kind of radio that isn't angry, that isn't name calling. And by the way, I would be saying the same thing no matter which side did it. I really like radio as entertainment. There are still some amazing announcers on the air. I only scratched the surface. I mean, 100 years of radio in Boston. But I hope I've at least given you a sense. Radio, like I said, was the first mass medium that brought you to an event as it was actually happening. And in the process, you made friends. The DJs, in many ways, were your friends. You bonded with them. You liked listening to them. You enjoyed their personalities. They didn't just play the hits, they talked to you. Personality radio becomes really important. Today, radio is much more polarizing. And I think that's kind of unfortunate. To me, radio was always a best friend. It remains a best friend. There are still programs like the Morgan White Show where people will get on the air and just be friendly. Radio doesn't have to be about politics. It doesn't have to be polarizing. It can still be entertainment. It can still be a best friend. I love radio. And I hope I've been interesting and I hope I've been informative. And thank you so much for listening.
Donna,
if you
wonderful
have questions,
job.
I'd be very happy to take them.
Great. Let's take a few minutes of questions for sure. Let me see here. So Vicky, I'm going to work backwards here. Vicky says, thank you. Patricia says, great walk down memory lane. Love your enthusiasm. Vicky says, radio has really become a tool of polarization, unfortunately. Phyllis notes that I have a box of WMEX and WRKO top 40s from the early 70s, and she remembers John H. from WMEX.
I have an entire collection. If we were doing this live, I would have brought my rare memorabilia. I have surveys from the old WCOP when it did top 40. I have surveys from WMEX. I have various and sundry surveys. And I love talking about this. Several of you are talking. Steve, by the way, I love you too. And I love what you do at your station. Yeah, I'm enthusiastic. Radio is my life. Radio changed my life. I miss radio every day of my life. I'm one of those people, when the Telecommunications Act of 1996 came along, 20,000 of us lost our jobs because of media consolidation. And I had to reinvent myself. And I went back to school at the age of 55, and I got my PhD at the age of 64. I'm a media historian. I'm a professor, but my heart is still with radio. As I said way back at the beginning, I couldn't have discovered Rush without radio. I mean, I couldn't have gotten the Mayor play without radio. I couldn't have gotten through my childhood without radio. Arnie Ginsberg was like a friend, even though I didn't meet him until years later. But every market had someone like that. And it was such a privilege to grow up listening to that. And I'm not going to tell you, oh, the good old days. There were no good old days, okay? Every era has good stuff and bad stuff. But radio really was like a companion and a friend. And to some degree, it still is today. I didn't get to Dave Maynard. I didn't get to a whole bunch of folks that I wanted to get to. I cut a few slides because it was pretty obvious we were running close to time. But there were so many people out there that you would listen to them and you would feel like, yeah, I feel better now. They could change your mood. That's the kind of radio I love the best.
Mary Ann says, great presentation. Dave Maynard and David Bernoy were my favorites. Quite different personalities, but always informative and interesting. Mike says, when you were doing your gig in Cleveland, was there communication with the Canadian radio community regarding best practices and the music?
Well, actually, back then, freeform, progressive, underground, album rock was still new. And because it was still new, there weren't a lot of rules. It wasn't like, oh, here's the format, and you're not going to really start getting formats till the mid-70s. So we were in just under that. And yeah, we were able to do stuff that today we would probably be told not to do. So yeah, we had lots of good relationships with the record companies. In my case, the record companies were really puzzled by me. I don't smoke, I don't drink, I don't do drugs, and I do remember the 60s, okay? And they'd come in and they'd be like, you know, the record promoters would come in like with the stuff that they often gave the DJs. And they were like, well, what can we give you? And I'm like, ice cream? And they would be, ice cream? I'm like, no, I'm serious. I don't do any of that other stuff. Let's go out for an ice cream. To this day, I'm still friends with a lot of the record promoters. So yeah, we had like this very courteous relationship. We understood the game. They all thought every single one of their records was a hit. We should play them all, which we weren't going to do. But in the end, it was a great time to be in radio. Like I said, there still weren't a lot of rules for album rock, so we could get away with stuff. And when I say get away with, we could play bands that weren't signed yet. We could bring bands in for live concerts. WBCN did a lot of that in Boston. Every city had, you know, Philadelphia, WMMR, up in Montreal, CHOM. Every city had at least one album rocker that was just creative, broke new bands, did all kinds of stuff you couldn't do. And it was amazing and it was fun. Was it perfect? No, of course not. But on the other hand, that creativity got a lot of bands their start, and I'm very grateful for that.
Colleen asks, do the call letters relate to the location of the station?
Yes and no. I just wrote an answer about this on a place called Quora. The original call letters started getting assigned to the ships at sea, okay, when they had wireless telegraphy, Morse code. And they were assigned totally arbitrarily. In 1912, the Department of Commerce got created, and that was the first agency to monitor and supervise broadcasting, okay? And it started giving out letters. The W meant east of the Mississippi, the K meant west of the Mississippi, but it was arbitrary. I mean, there were some Ks where they shouldn't have been. There were some Ws where they shouldn't have been. The early radio stations, some of the call letters were holdovers from the ships at sea, and some of them were kind of based on the old ham radio call letters without the numbers, okay? Like 1XE was an amateur call letter. The 1 stood for New England. But when 1XE got its call letters officially from the Department of Commerce, it became WGI, which didn't stand for anything. It was a sequential call letter, WGA, WGB, WGC. When they finally ran out of 3-letter call letters, they started doing 4. So yeah, you may find some early stations, heritage stations that still have those 3-letter calls. And as I said earlier, you could request a call letter if you wanted. If you were in Chicago, WLS in Chicago, some of you may remember them from the Top 40 days. WLS in Chicago. I shouldn't sing, but I just did. WLS in Chicago, world's largest store. It was a requested call because the station was originally owned by the Sears Roebuck Company, which in its day was a huge department store. WGN in Chicago was originally owned by the Chicago Tribune, world's greatest newspaper. So some owners wanted a requested call because it was like their initials or something. But in general, most of them just took whatever the government handed them. And yes, KDKA, east of the Mississippi, but they got a K call letter, go figure. WLAY in Alaska got a W call. The Department of Commerce was not exactly strict about these things. Things got a little bit stricter in 1927 with the creation of the Federal Radio Commission, the precursor to the FCC. But yes, there are a multitude of stations that had requested calls. We didn't have a ton of them in Boston. Like I said, WEEI, the Edison Electric Illuminating Company, in New Bedford, Massachusetts, about 50, 60 miles south of Boston, you had WNBH, New Bedford Hotel, back to the hotel stations. But for the most part, we just kind of took whatever the government gave us, and there you are.
All right, we're closing in on 3:15. Let's do 1 or 2 more questions. Gwen says, thank you from WUSB-FM New York. Have you heard, you see some more of your fans here. Have you heard any new bands you are excited about? And do you have any new books in the works?
As far as bands, it would take me too long to get into bands I'm excited about, but we can kind of message about that. But as far as books go, truthfully, haven't had time to write many new books, but I have written a bunch of articles and chapters, okay? I do a lot of writing for SABR, the Society for American Baseball Research, and I also do a lot of freelance articles that I can point you to links. Some of them are about radio history, some of them are about baseball history, women's history, etc. You know me, I'm always writing. I mean, I'm gonna be 75 years old, God willing, on Valentine's Day. Would you take me for it? And what keeps me young and cute is the fact that I continue to do research and I continue to love finding people's stories that I can tell. Who lives, who dies, who tells your story? There are so many stories that deserve to be told. I'm a cancer survivor 7 years now. And for as long as I can tell those stories, I'm going to stay out there and I'm going to keep telling those stories.
Well, Donna, thank you so much for a great presentation. A lot of interaction in the chat and the Q&A. Sorry we didn't get to everyone's comments. I did save the chat and I will forward it to Donna so she'll know what she missed. There was a couple of interesting anecdotes in there. But Donna,
you're welcome to email me. I'm very public about my email, which is dlh@donnahalper.com. So if you really want to like ask a question that you didn't get to, shoot me an email. I answer my email.
Excellent. Thank you for that, Donna. So folks, look for an email from me later today with a link to this recording and a link to a feedback survey. And I hope everyone enjoys the rest of their afternoon and evening. So thank you again, Donna, and we'll see you. We'll see you down the road. Yeah.
Thanks for being here.
Thank you, Donna. Bye-bye.